This is the most personal video I have made so far. It is about the last letter sent by my great uncle from the trenches a few days before his death at the Battle of the Somme. He was born on the 18th of April 1890 and killed on the 3rd of September 1916 in an attack on the village of Guinchy as part of the Battle of the Somme, or more accurately, during the Battle of Ginchy. My uncle's full name was George Ernest Knightly Evans. The Knightly refers to the close connections between the Evans and Knightly families and appeared in my branch of the Evanses for a few generations. The connections between these two families went back to before the famine. Both families rented houses and land in the Killorglin parish located to the west of Kerryman in Kerry. They intermarried at least once, possibly more often. On 7th of April 1839, my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Evans, married Catherine Knightly. There are still Knightleys in Castlemaine, at least there is a pub there with that name. George Ernest Knightly Evans was born in Killorglin. His father, called George Knightly Evans, had moved there. He had a farm and was a merchant and accountant, as well as having an inn on Langford Street. However, I think this was run by his wife, Julia Murphy. Ireland was changing at this time. The Land War and the rise of the Irish Parliamentary Party under Parnell contributed to the rise of the Catholic middle class. George Knightly Evans was obviously part of this. He and Julia had many children. It is not clear how many in total, possibly 17 or 18, though only 11 or 12 survived. Another big change at this time was the rapid decline of the Irish language. However, the Evans household in Killorglin seems to have been a bilingual one. In the 1901 census, both George and Julia and the household servants are recorded as being able to speak Irish and English, while in 1911 the entire household, including the numerous children, are recorded as having Irish and English. There was one exception, the oldest child, John Vincent, 27 years of age at this time, with his occupation being recorded as a farmer. Ultimately, he would inherit the farm in Killorglin. In the 1901 census, George Ernest is the fourth child listed. However, at least 2 or 3 of his siblings born before him had died by this time. Even in a relatively prosperous Catholic family, the death rate of children was very high. Taking the census as a mark of the children that survived, George Ernest was the 4th oldest child, the 3rd oldest son. Several of the Evans boys were sent to school in Blackwell College in Dublin. I'm not sure where the daughters studied, though it is possible they went to Laurel Hill in Limerick. After school, George Ernest went to UCC to study medicine, starting there in 1913. His eldest brother would inherit the farm. The next, my grandfather Thomas Evans, had already gone to Glenbeigh, where he first opened a shop and then built around it the Towers Hotel. His main customers were junior British officers coming to the artillery base at Rossbay. More senior officers would stay at the Glenbeigh Hotel, which Thomas Evans would later buy. George Ernest seemed to be following another path to social mobility by becoming a doctor. However, events overtook him. The lead up to the First World War in Ireland was a turbulent period. Home Rule had finally been passed in 1912, despite having been postponed for 2 years. It was due to come into effect in 1914. However, in parts of Ireland, as is well known, there was strong opposition to this. In the north of Ireland, Unionist opposition would result in the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force, or the UVF. This triggered the formation of the Irish Volunteers in the rest of the country. It also indirectly resulted in the Kerry Mutiny, when senior British officers threatened to resign rather than take action against Unionists if the latter staged a coup or took unlawful action against the implementation of Home Rule. The government was forced to back down, contributing to the fervent atmosphere in Ireland. However, the outbreak of World War I averted open conflict, at least temporarily. Home Rule was postponed until after the war, and large numbers from each volunteer force enlisted in the army. Thousands of Irish enlisted in the British Army. Around 200,000 from the entire island served in the conflict. Some 60,000 of these were already in the army. 24,000 were from the Nationalist Volunteers, while 26,000 from the UVF and 80,000 from neither force. More importantly, of the 130,000 who volunteered from Ireland, 90,000 of these joined in 1914 and 1915. Once the brutality of the war became well known, the number of volunteers declined a lot. Where does George Ernest Knightly Evans fit into this fervent scenario? It's hard to say. It is very probable he was a supporter of the Irish Nationalist Party, as his brother Thomas had apparently been a councillor for this party in Kerry before the war. Although it's impossible to know for definite why he volunteered, it is probable that this was related to the idea of preserving Home Rule as well as helping Catholic Belgium. As a result, probably sometime in late 1914, he left UCC to take up a commission in the Leinster Regiment. Doing the research for this video was enlightening in a way I did not expect. The war was a major bureaucratic challenge. Coping with the records produced has been another challenge ever since. So many men and women served in World War I that preserving the relevant documentation is difficult. Large numbers of records have been digitized in recent decades, yet because so many served, it is easy for details to be lost. In the 1920s, apparently some records were thrown away, others were destroyed by German bombing in World War II. The official account of George Ernest's service in the army, called the Long Record for Officers, is kept at the UK National Archives in Kew. Unfortunately, it is not yet available online. One day I will visit them. Hopefully, they will help to fill in the many gaps in George Ernest's story. For now, I will concentrate on his last letter. Although we do not know exactly when George Ernest Evans enlisted, we do know which regiment he joined. On the 2nd of July 1915, he was appointed a second lieutenant in the 3rd Battalion of the Leinster Regiment. The official name of this regiment was the Prince of Wales Leinster Regiment, Royal Canadians, with Royal Canadians being in brackets. This unwieldy name resulted from the amalgamation of two previous regiments. The question arises here, why did George Ernest join the Leinster Regiment instead of a Munster one? Fortunately, this seems easy to answer. The battalion he joined, the 3rd Battalion, was a reserve one. It was stationed in Cork from August 1914 to November 1917. It is probable that he joined this regiment simply because it was in Cork. However, this makes accounting for George Ernest's military service more difficult. The 3rd Battalion was a home-based reserve battalion. Its purpose was recruitment and training. It never actually saw action as a battalion. However, its members were attached to other units when necessary, but remained part of the 3rd Battalion for bureaucratic purposes. In other words, they were sent, when needed, to other units and other theatres, but still remained part of the 3rd Battalion of the Leinster Regiment. This means that although my uncle fought with another unit at the Somme, when he died, he was recorded as being a member of the Leinster Regiment. Bureaucratic reasoning that does not help those investigating this area for the first time. Indeed, it can be rather confusing when trying to account for someone's military service. Probably he spent many months training in Cork. Eventually, he was dispatched to France. Again, the records are patchy. He seems to have served in a number of regiments. The Imperial War Museum records him as having served in the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, then the Leinster Regiment, then the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and finally the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment. According to the account in UCC about his former students, he, open quote, served with a number of regiments, the Royal Leinster Regiment 3rd Battalion and the Royal Irish Regiment 2nd Battalion, reported missing 3 times, end quote. Once again, when I get to the archives in Kew, I hope to be able to flesh out these details. For now, this is all the details we have about his service. The vast expansion in the size of the British Army and the horrific nature of the fighting on the Western Front created massive challenges. Organising the recruitment, training, deployment and supply of men became much more complex. Reserve battalions seem to have functioned as stopgaps, sending men to where they were needed. Thus, although George Ernest built up experience in fighting on the Western Front, he did not become attached to a particular unit. This is probably why he remained a second lieutenant, and also why it's hard to find him in the records. Not being permanently attached to a unit probably reduced his chances of promotion, of making a name for himself, or being mentioned in dispatches. He was in essence just a little cog in a very bloody war. It's now time to move on to the Battle of Guillemot, George Ernest Knightly Evans' final letter and his death. Guillemot is a small part of the Battle of the Somme. The latter started in July and would run until November. Guillemot is a village in France. Near it is Longueval, Delvaux Wood and Guinchy. All were fought over intensely with horrific casualties. Both Guillemot and Guinchy were on elevated ground, thus making them important. In both villages, the Germans were well entrenched and fought hard. At this stage, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment was part of the 22nd Brigade, 7th Division. At the end of August, the battalion spent a few days in Pommier Redoubt, located near the village of Mametz. In this relatively quiet period, George Ernest wrote his last letter. As we'll see shortly, he complained about the weather. In fact, the weather had been so bad that a planned attack in Ginchy had to be called off, giving his battalion a little respite. They spent the 30th of August and the 1st of September in a rest camp called 71 North. The latter was near Citadel New Military Cemetery, where many of those who fell are buried. On the 2nd of September, the battalion moved back to Pommier Redoubt and then to Montauban Alley, about 200 metres north of Montauban village. On the 3rd of September, the attack on Guinchy finally took place. The 2nd Battalion was in reserve to the other 3 battalions in the 22nd Brigade, meaning that its men were used to reinforce or support these regiments. The fighting was very confused. Guinchy was captured at one stage, but then recaptured by the Germans. A counterattack by 2 companies of the Royal Irish Regiment failed due to severe casualties according to the battalion's war diary. The war diary of the 2nd Battalion contains various accounts of the fighting, all of which praise the soldiers. However, the attack was a failure. The battalion suffered heavy casualties. 8 officers were killed and 5 wounded, while 218 NCOs and men were killed, wounded or missing. The figures for the non-officers were not broken down. Among the dead was George Ernest Knightly Evans. So far, I've not been able to find the exact details of his death. He's not mentioned in the accounts contained in the war diary. He died in the fighting, but we do not know how. This makes his death feel even sadder, at least to me. At 2:30 a.m. on the 4th of September, the battered battalion fell back to Folly Trench and was then pulled back to Pommier Redoubt. The next day, various stragglers made it back, including a group of 100 men who had not received the order to fall back. Guinchy itself would only be taken a week later, after much heavy fighting. Many Irish fought and died in this latter action. Among the dead would be Tom Kettle, an Irish Nationalist MP and poet. On the 28th of August, my great-uncle sent what would be his last letter home to my grandfather. Its text is as follows. 28th of the 8th, 1916. My dear Tom, I just got your letter. By Jove, what a card to send. Glenbeigh at its best, with the towers at its infancy. For the last half hour or so, I've been tracing out the road from the towers to Ross, where we pitched our tent 2 years ago, and from there to the Strand with the net. I can picture the whole scene, far more than if I were really there, as I was always in rather too good form when going out in fishing stunts. I also traced out Bertie's house. How is he, his mother and all that crowd? Has the last rose of summer left Fire Cottage yet? Mrs. Bateman, I mean. We have had frightful bad weather here, and absolutely nothing to keep out the rain but our oil sheet. However, I soon fixed matters in that direction. I have a Tommy's greatcoat and a riding cape, but as our kit has reduced very much, I shall have to part with them, perhaps tonight, and maybe not at all. Well, if I went through half at home I was a dead man, appendicitis, pneumonia, and so other such diseases. But I was never in better health, and I don't have to do for the bully and biscuits. Don't send any more cigs. I can get a tin of cigs here for 1 franc 40, which is 1 shilling and a half pence, and a £1/4 tin of tobacco for 1 franc 50, which is 1 shilling 1 penny and a half. Beside my ration cigs, which is a packet per week, with all the fanciest names under the sun, anything from Dolly Gray up. I suppose I'd surprise you very much if I told you I struck up against your charger yesterday morning. He's a changed horse, very worn out. I recognized him immediately and thought I might see Finn's, but no, he's not here. All we want is fine weather. 2 heavy showers and we were up to our neck in mud. I'm late for this day's post, and remember, when you do not get letters punctually, don't start worrying about me. I'll always send letters up to the last moment, and then the field cards will come into play. Don't send parcels either, as they're the most expensive on your side, and they may have to follow me from place to place. I'll let you know when I want things. Well, I'm in the best of health and in great form. Best love to you all, your brother Ernest. It is a sad letter, but contains great insights into conditions in the trenches around the Somme. The weather was awful, too much mud, trying to be cheerful, telling his brother that he was in good health, and not to send parcels or tobacco. What surprised me the most was that he had met his brother's charger, his horse, and that the latter was completely worn out. He was also keeping an eye out for another horse, perhaps his own. George Ernest Knightly Evans was killed on 3rd of September 1916. He's buried in Delville Wood Cemetery. However, his name is also on the same grave in Killorglin in County Kerry as his parents, and also his brother Tom and the latter's wife Kathleen, my grandparents. His name must have been put there by my grandfather, who kept the final letter, and probably never forgot his little brother killed in the horrific fighting in France in 1916. Indeed, this can be seen in a beautiful stained glass window he put up in memory of his brother in Glenbeigh Church. This is in what can perhaps be called a transept, and consists of 3 different frames, with his name being on the central one. Interestingly, a few metres away, around the corner of the church, another window is dedicated to the IRA captain Frank O'Grady, killed in Glenbeigh by Free State troops in 1923. Indeed, Glenbeigh must be one of the few Catholic churches in Ireland with windows commemorating these very different aspects of Irish nationalism in the period between 1912 and 1924.